The movie opens with the train moving steadily along the tracks as passengers settle into their seats. Dr. Louis Shaler, a dedicated physician, is dozing in his seat beside his young son, Max. Max tugs at Louis, begging him to play. Louis, still half asleep, agrees, and they engage in a game of rock, paper, scissors. Their moment is interrupted when Louis receives a phone call. The noise in the carriage prompts him to step into the corridor for some peace and quiet. While on the phone, Louis notices Max chatting with a woman seated nearby. In his excitement, Max accidentally spills a drink on her clothes. Louis quickly ends his call and rushes back to offer her a tissue, apologizing for the mishap. He also makes sure Max apologizes. The woman, understanding, assures him it's not a big deal and declines his offer to pay for the cleaning. As they settle back into their seats, Louis explains to Max that he has to stay with his grandmother because Louis has to work. Intrigued, the woman asks about his profession. Louis briefly describes a challenging case involving a rare disease. Meanwhile, tension arises when a man starts smoking in the train. The conductor approaches to enforce the no-smoking policy, leading to a heated argument. Another passenger steps in to support the conductor, and eventually, the smoker reluctantly throws his cigarette out, but not without hurling insults at both the conductor and the intervening passenger. Suddenly, a moment of panic ensues as Max opens the train door and nearly falls out. With quick reflexes, Louis grabs him just in time. Initially scolding Max out of fear, Louis quickly softens his tone when he sees his son's shock and reassures him gently. The conductor continues his rounds, checking tickets as the journey resumes. Louis realizes that the woman he had been talking to is gone. Max mentions that she didn't say goodbye. They both settle back to sleep. Meanwhile, after completing his rounds, the conductor moves to the corridor. Suddenly, he is grabbed by an unseen force. Despite his efforts to resist, he is ultimately overpowered and dragged away. Later, Louis wakes up and sees that the woman has returned. They both notice that they are the last passengers in their carriage. He asks her where she's getting off, and she replies, Tunbridge. Louis mentions that he's also getting off at Tunbridge, noting that it's his last chance for some rest since he won't be able to sleep at work. The woman reveals she works in events management, describing it as boring compared to Louis's job as a doctor, which seems exciting and fulfilling to her. Louis explains that his work often results in sleepless nights. The woman then shares that she had abandoned her friends that night, who were trying to cheer her up after a recent breakup by organizing a night out in London. They joke about the rigors of partying, with Louis humorously noting that, as a single dad, he can't imagine partying all night. The conversation takes a lighter turn when she playfully asks him to guess her medical condition, leading Louis to demonstrate his diagnostic skills by checking her for a heart murmur and explaining the process. As they continue to chat, the woman jokes about the drink stain on her coat, teasingly suggesting that Louis should buy her a new one with his doctor's salary. She offers him her number, introducing herself as Sarah Barwell. She then tells him to get some rest, promising to wake him before Tunbridge. Louis wakes up suddenly and realizes the train has stopped. He peers through the window but can't see anything outside. Seeing that Max is still asleep, he wakes Sarah and asks her to look after Max while he goes to find the conductor. As he makes his way through the train, he encounters a man and informs him that someone outside appears to be hurt. The man dismissively suggests that Louis call an ambulance but insists there's nothing more he can do. Following the man's advice, Louis calls for an ambulance. When Louis returns, he finds Max and Sarah playing together. He tells Sarah that he saw someone crawling by the tracks earlier, which prompts them to search the train for the guard together. As they near their destination, Louis and Max prepare to get off, saying their goodbyes. Sarah reminds Louis that he has her number and kisses him. However, the train doesn't stop, causing Louis and Max to miss their stop. A woman from the first-class carriage invites them to sit with her, and they accept. Determined to address the issue, Louis heads to the driver's cabin to inform him that the train has missed its stop. Louis calls a colleague to explain that he is stuck on the train, and then he tries to communicate with the driver via an intercom. The driver asks how many passengers are left, and Louis replies that there are 6. Lewis attempts to explain that he missed his stop and that someone was injured by the tracks, but the driver stops responding. Frustrated, Lewis knocks on the driver's door, trying to stress his urgency as a doctor who needs to get to work. The man Lewis spoke to earlier approaches, questioning if he found the guard. Lewis mentions that he only found the guard's ticket machine and expresses concern that something may be wrong with the driver. The man suggests the driver is simply ignoring him, adding that he would do the same. Suddenly, the train shakes violently. Lewis pulls the emergency alarm, but there is no response. The man also notices the train has passed his stop, causing him to panic. John, the smoker from earlier, joins them, and Lewis shares his sighting of a man on the tracks, which heightens the tension. Peter, the older man, begins questioning John suspiciously, asking about his attire and whether he works for the railway. John clarifies that he works as a cleaner for the London Underground and hasn't seen the guard recently. Peter introduces himself to Lewis and continues probing John for information. Feeling accused, John insists he hasn't been outside. Peter then suggests that whoever tampered with the brakes might also be the person driving the train, hinting at a sinister plot. The atmosphere grows tense as they grapple with the mystery and their growing fear. Sarah arrives, and Lewis immediately asks where Max is. She reassures him that Max is with Elaine. Lewis and Sarah then head to see if there's a way to activate the brakes, and John joins them, inquiring if they are married. Peter reappears and warns them to stop meddling, explaining that the police are already in contact with the driver and have advised against any action that might jeopardize their efforts to stop the train. Despite Peter's warnings, Lewis manages to open a door, and they enter the compartment. Peter keeps urging them not to touch anything. Inside, they discover there's no brake mechanism to stop the train. John suggests they could jump out through the back door, but the others dismiss the idea as too dangerous. As they continue searching, they find a handbrake and attempt to use it. The train begins to slow down forcefully, causing sparks to fly as the wheels scrape against the tracks. However, the train suddenly accelerates again. In the chaos, Peter tries to stop them, but John punches him, pushing him away. Their desperate attempt to stop the train proves futile, and they regroup with the others to discuss their next plan. Lewis reiterates that the driver asked how many passengers were left, suggesting something isn't right. John proposes breaking down the driver's door to confront him, but Peter sarcastically notes they'd need a battering ram and suggests they wait for the police instead. The group speculates about their current location, believing they are approaching Stonegate. They discuss the possibility of a level crossing after Stonegate, hoping that someone might be expecting them. They debate whether the crossing is automatic or manual, concluding that if it's manual, it would depend on the driver to stop the train, assuming the brakes even work. Peter points out the danger of hitting a car at the crossing, which could derail the train, a grim possibility that John finds darkly amusing. As the seriousness of the situation sinks in, they realize that hitting the crossing at 100 miles per hour could be catastrophic. Lewis suggests calling the police to ensure they are prepared for their arrival. They calculate that the level crossing is a couple of miles past a tunnel before the station, estimating they have about 80 seconds to figure things out at their current speed. The gravity of their predicament becomes painfully clear as they brace for the danger ahead. Peter keeps trying to contact the police, but their efforts seem futile. Meanwhile, Lewis focuses on keeping Max calm, with Sarah joining him and playing games to distract him. Suddenly, Lewis notices a police car outside just as the train collides with a car crossing the tracks, causing a massive explosion. Overcome by shock and stress, Elaine begins to feel unwell and eventually passes out. Lewis rushes to her side and discovers she's in cardiac arrest. He frantically searches her bag for medication but finds nothing. Despite his best efforts to perform CPR, Elaine does not survive. John then approaches Lewis, insisting they need to break down the driver's door. Initially, Lewis is reluctant to give up on Elaine, continuing his attempts at CPR. However, the urgency of the situation and the others' insistence that they must act forces him to abandon his efforts and join them. Lewis picks up a fire extinguisher and tries to break down the driver's door, but his efforts are in vain. John then attempts to use a metal rod to break the door, but this too proves ineffective. Determined, Lewis smashes the glass window. Despite John's hesitation, Lewis climbs through the broken window and enters the compartment. Inside, Lewis finds the body of the conductor. He then notices a tinted glass panel and sees the driver's hand through it. Desperately, he begs the driver to stop, but there is no response. Lewis attempts to break the tinted glass, triggering an alarm. Ignoring the blaring sound, he continues his efforts to open the door, but his attempts with the metal rod are futile. They return to their seats, and Peter shares what he has learned. He mentions that authorities are working on something further down the line and have found the driver, just as Lewis described, on the tracks. The driver had been attacked by someone on the train. Lewis realizes he saw the attacker earlier, recognizing his motorcycle helmet. He recalls the man nearly got off at London Bridge as if he had missed his stop. Peter theorizes that this individual killed the guard, dragged him into the compartment, released the air from the brakes, and then took over the driver's cab, throwing the driver out in the process. Peter then brings up the Moorgate crash from 30 years ago, a tragic event on the Northern Line where a train accelerated into the buffers instead of slowing down, killing the driver and 40 other passengers. The cause was never definitively proven, but there was speculation it was a case of driver suicide. The group finds a manual and tries to figure out how to stop the train. John explains a method, but Peter remains skeptical. John mentions that he graduated in engineering, trying to reassure the others. He then announces his intention to go outside the train to uncouple the carriages. This prompts immediate concern from the others, who warn him it's deadly. Peter interjects, explaining that after Crowhurst, trains typically slow down due to poor track conditions. He suggests that if John is determined to go outside, he should wait until after Crowhurst, when the train would be forced to reduce speed. John argues that the current driver won't slow down, speculating that the driver intends to derail the train. Peter agrees, noting that the driver seems suicidal but doubts he would want to die in an unremarkable location. The group decides to wait while discussing their personal lives to pass the time. As they approach Crowhurst, John prepares to go outside and uncouple the train carriages. He begins his task but is interrupted by the sudden approach of a single-track tunnel. Lewis acts quickly, saving John by pulling him back on board just seconds before the train enters the tunnel. Inside, they try to calm John after the harrowing experience. Suddenly, the train comes to a halt, but they find they can't open the doors to escape. It turns out that the police have set up a blockade of sandbags, which only temporarily stop the train. The narrow clearance of the tunnel prevents the passengers from opening the doors, leaving them trapped inside. Suspecting they are now close to crashing into the buffers at Hastings Station, Lewis decides to create an improvised explosive using the last remaining fire extinguisher. The explosion successfully destroys the floor panels, giving them access to the coupler. Peter volunteers to detach it, but tragically, he accidentally falls through the gap and is killed. The burning carriage is separate, speeding through a suburban station as helpless police officers watch. Lewis remains in the front car and instructs John to use the rear handbrake to stop their section. John and Sarah manage to halt their carriage using the handbrake. With the train leaking fuel and burning around him, Lewis takes a moment to compose himself. Summoning his courage, he runs and leaps from the carriage just as the entire vehicle explodes behind him. The movie concludes with Sarah and Max rushing to Lewis, finding him alive and conscious. Relieved and emotional, they embrace him. John joins them shortly after, and they all sit together, reflecting on the harrowing experience they have just survived, grateful to be alive and reunited. Thanks for watching. Until next time, have a nice day.